We are at a point in our lessons where we are discussing Colorado State Social Studies Standard for 8th graders, Civics 2A. Students will describe instances of major political, economic, or cultural change and their reasons. We are going to do this by focusing on the time period after the Revolutionary War um, and focus on the Articles of Confederation and the events that led up to the frustration and the importance of Shay's rebellion. To start, we are going to talk about the basic ideas found in the state constitutions. Following the revolution, even though we were so-called United States of America, each state was basically its own independent country. In each of the constitutions were some basic ideas. We're going to talk about 7 of them right now. Natural rights and higher law. For the most part, everybody realized that the purpose of government was to protect life, liberty, and property, and that the Constitution was the topmost law that everyone must obey. The constitutions were a social contract. It was the people that agreed to form the government to protect their rights. Because the people formed the government, the idea of popular sovereignty was in all of the constitutions. The people were the highest authority. Government got its power from the people because the people gave it power. The people were represented in the government. Not everybody participated, they were represented. The legislature, or the lawmakers, were the elective representatives of the people. Power was separated. There was a separation of power. Government, and therefore power, was split up between different branches of government. There was a system of checks and balances in place. A check is an override. It's an override of power. So each of the branches had different things that it could do that other branches couldn't do. Power was checked and balanced between the different branches of the government. But the legislature was supreme. Legislative supremacy. The people elected the legislature, the lawmakers. This most democratic branch was given most of the power. The reason why the lawmakers were given most of the power was because the founders feared giving one person, one executive, too much power. In their history, people abused the power. There was a national constitution. The national constitution was called the Articles of Confederation, and there were problems. One of the problems was that Congress did not have any money, and it didn't have the power to raise money. The national government was a national lawmaking body, a national legislature, a Congress. To get money, they needed to raise taxes. Congress could ask for help for states to raise taxes, but they couldn't make states help. Some states didn't, some did. When it came down to it, most argued about what was their fair share of taxes. Congress had no power over the state governments or their citizens. Plain and simple. They could not make the people obey the national laws. Congress could not make states live up to trade agreements with other nations. There were actually people, individual citizens, that imported goods from other countries and then didn't pay for them. The other countries stopped doing business with the United States. It's bad business. And the national government could not make the states or make the individuals pay. Congress had no power to regulate trade between the states. Within our own country, this own United States of America, they couldn't make things work. Trade between the states and business became impossible. And finally, the last problem that we're going to discuss has to do with property. Citizens thought that their property rights were threatened. People got together and they formed groups, they formed factions to protect their rights. Well, then others were excluded, and there's no way to stop this. People found ways to promote their own interests at the expense of others. The result and the methods were unfair. So there were problems. So let's compare what was working for the state governments to the national government. We're going to focus on 3 areas. We're going to focus on representation, the separation of powers, and checks and balances. So how were the people represented in the state governments? Well, it was the lawmakers had the most power. The lawmakers were elected property owners. And this reflected about 70%, represented about 70% of the landowners. Yes, the white landowners. Now, 70%, that's a pretty good number. At the national level, each state got 1 vote in the Congress. And that's pretty fair. Each state is their own little country. They get their own vote. However, what do you do when one state has a lot more people than the other states? Should that state get more votes? That vote represents more people. Should there be more votes? So, the next thing we're going to focus on is how was power separated at the state and the national government. At the state level, there were 3 branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. At the national level, there was only a legislature, only that lawmaking Congress, but it was intentionally made very weak with limited power. With regards to power, it was checked and balanced both at the state and the national level. At the state level, the checks, the overrides, were handled in many ways. Usually, there was a 2-house legislature, 2 bodies that made laws, and if one side didn't like what the other was doing, you could override it. Also, power was checked and balanced by the people. The people had votes. If they didn't like the lawmakers were doing, they could vote them out of office or vote for somebody new. At the national level, the states had the power. It wasn't the people, it was the states. The states got to approve every action taken by Congress. So really, the National Congress couldn't do anything without the approval of the state. The state had the power. All of these things really combine to make, with other things, with other events, to make just kind of another perfect scenario for rebellion. And that's where we're going to focus next. We're going to focus on Shay's rebellion, the frustrations and the importance. There were financial troubles in 1786. Businesses failed, trade suffered, people were in debt. Soldiers who had fought in the Revolution still hadn't been paid. Congress could not control the country, and the people were worried. Farmers had it rough. Prices were low. They often could not pay their debts because of the low prices. Many lost their farms and their homes. Some even went to prison. And all basically felt that the state, that the government was not protecting their interests. So there was a rebellion. The farmers were fed up. They joined behind a guy named Daniel Shay, and these farmers closed down the courts where their cases were being heard. This was an attempt to keep the state from taking their farms. News spread, and courts in neighboring towns and states were also closed down. The rebellion was spreading. In January of 1787, Daniel Shay led 2,000 rebels to raid a federal arsenal where guns and ammunition are stored. The national government couldn't do anything about it. They'd been unable to control the rebels. So the question emerged, how could the country continue to exist if it could not maintain law and order? One of the basic purposes of government. Shay's rebellion forced people to examine the weaknesses of our national government under the Articles of Confederation. Now problems go back before the rebellion. In January of 1786, there were trade problems, and delegates were supposed to meet in Virginia to discuss these problems. But only 5 states showed up. Under the Articles of Confederation, to change anything, to handle any problems, you needed 9 states to agree. So no decisions could be made. Overall, there was general discontent. There was unhappiness. This led to violence in the form of Shay's Rebellion. The delegates realized there were a problem. They asked Congress for a convention of all the states. So invitations were sent out to all the states for a convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The inability to do anything, the rebellion, led to a significant change in the government, in the politics of our country.